All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa Silva, and welcome to the Wizen Center for Open Learning at American Jewish University. I am excited and honored to share our two presenters today, Dr. Saskia Coenen Snyder, and speaker Ruth Franklin. They are here with us today as experts in their own right on the Holocaust, on Anne Frank, and especially on Amsterdam during World War II. And so we're going to have an in-depth discussion today on author Ruth Franklin's new book. But before we do that, I'm just going to go ahead and also thank our partners at the Anne Frank Center at the University of South Carolina. They are also the official partner of the Anne Frank House, which just opened today in the United States in New York. So that is an exciting exhibit that is new to our friends over in New York. They are one of 3 permanent partner sites actually with Berlin and Buenos Aires. The Anne Frank Center circulates 18 bilingual traveling exhibitions with peer education programs from schools across the continent. So thank you to the Anne Frank Center of South Carolina for all that you do. And thank you to Saskia Coenen Snyder, who's a faculty affiliate at the Anne Frank Center at the University of South Carolina, for being here with us today. Also, as I've mentioned, author Ruth Franklin. She is the author of A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction, a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, and of Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, which was the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography, and she lives in Brooklyn, New York. But today she's going to be talking on her new book, The Many Lives of Anne Frank. A link to purchase that book will be in the chat, so definitely check that out. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our speakers, Dr. Saskia Coenen Snyder and Ruth Franklin. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Alyssa. And thank you, Ruth, for joining today to talk about this wonderful, I'll show it to everyone. So it just came out today. So congratulations on this new biography of Anne Frank. It's very timely, of course, as we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and International Holocaust Commemoration Day today. And so it's a very timely event. And you've written biographies before. What drew you to write one on Anne?
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you to everyone at American Jewish University for having me here today. It's such a pleasure to get to introduce my biography to everyone here. So yeah, why Anne? As Alyssa mentioned, I've written a biography of Shirley Jackson, the American writer. I write most frequently on books and other subjects in cultural journalism. And so Anne Frank, I think, doesn't necessarily seem an obvious choice. But, so of course, like all American Jewish girls, I read Anne Frank's diary when I was growing up. And it, of course, left a huge impression on me. I even visited the Anne Frank house as a child on a family visit to Europe. And I still remember how small those rooms felt to me, even as a child. But it really wasn't until later, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I started noticing media reports that missing pages or other somehow missing information was being discovered that had been left out of Anne Frank's diary. And whenever these reports appeared, they generated so much attention. Anne Frank is just the subject of so much fascination. I'm sorry, I'm sure you can hear the sirens going past my window. I am in New York City. But Anne Frank has always been a source of so much fascination for people around the world that it is, a worldwide media event when lost pages of her diary are found. And at the same time, I started to notice, how often she's evoked in political contexts, to talk about war crimes or, refugees or really, any kind of cause you might think of. It seems sometimes that Anne Frank has been evoked in combination with it. And it just struck me that the more that we treat her as an icon, the less we kind of retain our grip on who she really was as a person. And so I started to become interested in putting those two pieces of her together. The real person who lived and wrote this diary, in, as it turns out, a very unexpected an unconventional way. And then the kind of the global icon with her face on billboards and statues that she's turned into.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the really wonderful things about the book is that you kind of describe her really as a human being. Kind of take it's almost like a little an onion, kind of peeling the layers away of what Anne has been appropriated as so many times as as a feminist or as a kind of a literary prodigy in so many different ways, but to kind of really approach her again as a human being, and I think that that I learned so much. I mean, I teach this class on her and the history of the Holocaust at the university. I've done so for 15 years, but I learned so much from this book, not just about who the things we already knew, but also to kind of to little things that you were remarkable in picking up certain details that really gave us a whole new appreciation for her as a human being. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you very much for saying that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I wanted to hear a bit more about when you visited the Anne Frank house when you were 8. Can you tell us a little bit about what that experience was for her, besides being the spaces being small? What did it feel like for you to be in Amsterdam, or to kind of see this place, and see the city as a young as a young person?
You know, I think I had a very kind of peculiar experience of Amsterdam. And I'll say I grew up in a survivor family. My grandparents were both survivors they were both Polish deportees who were deported by Stalin and survived Stalin's camps. And they had, and their family members, my grandparents both had siblings who had survived the Holocaust and then moved to different places in Europe. So I grew up with family in the Netherlands, and also family in Paris. And
Mm.
and my grandparents would go every couple of summers to visit their relatives, and sometimes would take me along. And so I grew up, was very lucky to experience Europe in this way. But to be honest, I experienced it very much in the shadow of the Holocaust.
Mhm.
Because these trips were always about visiting these relatives, some of whom had numbers on their arms, and who talked a lot about the war and about their experiences. And so certainly I had the feeling as a child that the Holocaust was not distant from us. It lived on very vividly in the memories of these people, to whom I was very close. And I felt, very strongly kind of a part of that world.
Yeah. It's interesting for me to hear, as a Dutch person who I'm born and raised in the Netherlands. I lived in the US now for a long time, but that it seems to me that for young Americans, that they tend to be much more exposed to Anne than Dutch people were. Kind
Yeah.
of interesting ways is that we didn't really at when we went to had school trips of some kind, the Anne Frank house wouldn't be in the top 5 of places for school children to go. And so for us to grow up with Anne, we grew up with her almost as if she was. We would go to different kinds of museums or different kinds of places, but Anne Frank, in that sense, wasn't as kind of central as it is to young people then as it is maybe now. And so I was kind of curious to hear what your experience was as a young child then going to Amsterdam and visiting her house.
That is
Um,
fascinating. I mean, I hear that from my Dutch friends as well, that Anne Frank it doesn't have the same kind of presence in Dutch culture as she does in American culture. And, I think that says so much about the reception of the diary in America, which I
mhm,
talk about quite a bit in this book. That, the diary obviously was published first in the Netherlands in 1947, and then in France and in Germany. But it wasn't until it was published in America that it became the kind of global phenomenon that it has now become. And I think a lot of the reason for that is because of the way that it was marketed in America, and to emphasize Anne's universality and the extent to which she really was seen and argued to be just like, just an ordinary girl, and the Franks were just an ordinary family, like any other family who
mhm.
had experienced this terrible persecution.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes you wonder if she would have become such an international icon had it not been for the way that the United States had really um, uh, made her popular in ways that that wasn't the case at all.
Yeah,
In all.
really embraced her in this
Mhm.
wholehearted way.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk in the book about a popular misconception that many Americans and many people across the world have today of the diary, right? Is that somehow what we read today was the way that it was found on the floor the moment of that they were arrested and deported, and that one of her helpers, Ruth, found it the way that we read it, which is still a very persistent myth. Can you elaborate a little bit about this? Because that's,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. And
it's
this is
important.
one of the elements of her story that I find the most fascinating, actually, is that this myth about the diary has persisted despite the fact that it's been well known now, for the past 30 years and more, that Anne's diary, as we read it now, is edited. And when people think about that, it's often said that Otto Frank, her father, censored her diary, that he censored her criticisms of her mother or her thoughts about her developing body, all kinds of stuff like that. But what people really don't realize is that, I wouldn't say that Anne censored herself because, that is an inaccurate way to represent what the act of editing is. But what she had was of course, she had been keeping a diary, from the day that she received it on her 13th birthday, which was June 12th, 1942, shortly before the Franks would go into hiding. And then she kept that diary for just over 2 years. The annex was raided August 4th, 1944, and at that point, Anne and everyone living there was deported. So she had just over 2 years of diary entries. And towards the end of this period, in March 1944, she heard a Dutch government minister, a minister from the government in exile, speaking on the radio, and he called for citizens to keep documents from the war years, their private documents like diaries and letters, to be included in a future national archive that would explain to the world what had happened to the Dutch people under Nazi occupation. And Anne writes of hearing this on the radio together with the other residents in the annex, and she said they all made a rush at my diary. She realized immediately that her diary was just such a text that could play an important role in an archive like this. But what she also realized was that the way she had written it, it wouldn't work as a
Mhm.
public text. She had written it as a private, personal diary. And I think, many of us have kept diaries, some sporadically, some, faithfully perhaps throughout our lives. We all know that diaries are, kind of haphazard. They're written without an audience in mind, and they tend to lack context. And Anne, after hearing the minister call for these documents, she went back and looked over her diary, and she realized that it wasn't going to work as a public-facing document. In order for anybody else to be able to read it and understand it, she was going to have to make major changes to it. And I think it's truly remarkable that she did this. She went back to the beginning and she rewrote her diary in another version. And scholars refer to this as version B. It's Anne's version. It's a little bit different than version C, which is the version that Otto would eventually publish. And it's also different in important ways from version A, her rough draft. But the major change that she made to it was she took out some elements that she saw as too personal to expose to the world, but she also added a lot of information that would help to contextualize the Nazi persecution of the Jews, thinking, of a future audience that might not understand what had happened to her.
Mhm. Yeah, and in that sense, I like the way you described it as a very messy process, right? This wasn't a diary that was perfect from the moment that they found it on the floor. She edits it, also edits it, her father, right? Taking out certain things that he didn't think were appropriate, or he wanted to protect the privacy of certain people. Then the editors too are in conversation with him after the war about how they want to market it, what they think is appropriate and not appropriate. And so there are all these questions about what should we include, or what would Anne wanted to include. And so it really becomes clear of how much this is it was a work in progress that was revised and added. And so it is, I think, important for us to kind of see that that the writing process took place in the attic, but then also afterwards still about what, and the different versions that come out later on, the different publications, and then things are added later on, which make the news. And so
Right.
it's very much a kind of a living document in that sense.
Absolutely. And I think, the reason it's important to know this and to understand that Anne edited her own diary, that she wished it to be published, that she wished it to serve this purpose. I think it's important to note to respect her legacy, to respect her intentions. And, just to keep in mind that, the book is published as Diary of a Young Girl, which I find, a little bit infantilizing and diminishing. We live in a culture, even now, but especially in the 40s and 50s, that tended to diminish women's accomplishments or girls' accomplishments. And then the fact that Anne's diary is so often spoken of as this kind of found object, as one Dutch novelist has famously called it, as if Anne Frank had, at the age of 15 or 13, or, people say she wrote the diary at 13, which is not entirely true. She started the diary at 13, but she revised it at 15. But anyway, as if this teenage girl had somehow sort of accidentally written this book that would turn out to be one of the great texts of Holocaust literature. And I think that it's demeaning to her to sort of to erase her very careful and conscious desire to write a testimonial work.
Yeah, absolutely. What did you make of Otto's actions after the war to decide or to take certain pieces out, especially about her budding sexuality, or that some people said that she was too critical of her mother, and so Otto makes some kind of editorial decisions to take certain pieces out or to insert them later on. What did you make of that as a writer yourself?
Yeah, well, so I'll say just to start that I have the absolute deepest sympathy for Otto Frank as a man and also as a parent. When I started working on this book, one of my children was 13, the same age as Anne when she began writing the diary. And as a parent, I find it simply impossible to imagine the kind of pain that he must have experienced, surviving Auschwitz, returning, knowing that his wife had died there, and returning with the hope that his daughters would still come back, and eventually learning the truth, and then having his daughter's diary presented to him by Méprise, this woman, this heroine who sustained him along with the others in hiding, presenting it to him and saying, "This is this is your daughter's legacy to you." And I think, we just have to take a moment and consider the enormous pain that he must have experienced. So it's very often said that he censored Anne's thoughts about her diary, her thoughts about her body, her criticisms of her mother, and so on. And in most cases, this just isn't true. He left in, Anne was very, very critical of her mother. She also was very critical of Mrs. Van Pels, Peter's mother, the other family who were in hiding with them, as well as Fritz Pfeffer, the dentist who joined them, who she reserves really her worst vitriol for this poor man, who seems indeed not to have been very patient with her. She unleashes all her criticism on them, and for the most part, Otto left it in. I think he very rarely spoke about the changes that he made, because during his lifetime, most people weren't aware of them. The extent to which he had edited the diary didn't become clear until the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation published this large critical edition of the diaries in the late 80s. So for almost nobody knew that this had happened during Otto's life. But the few times that he did speak about it, he talked about trying to think through how Anne would have done. He said he tried to make the changes as she would have made them, trying to think through what an Anne who had survived the war, who would have been a very different person from the person who wrote that diary initially, thinking through what she would have wanted. But, the main misconception about his edits is that he mainly took things out, when the reality is that he also put things back in that Anne did not want to include in her B version. And the primary one of those is her romance with Peter. When we look at Anne's edits of her diary, she took out almost all of the entries about her feelings for Peter Van Pels. And when Otto went through it again, he put those back in. And, we can say that, well, now that Anne and Peter were both dead, he didn't have to worry about violating their privacy. But I also have to wonder if he did that simply because the romance of the diary is part of what makes it such a wonderful story. And also what makes it so relatable to people from all kinds of different backgrounds and places that, in the midst of all of this suffering, in this, incredibly, incredibly straitened circumstances, she nonetheless managed to have this beautiful little romance.
Yeah. And I think what I really enjoyed about the book is that you're not only kind of restoring Anne's humanity, right? Is that it's true. She was saucy and kind of really optimistic, and she would light up a room, but she could also be pretty, she was a teenager. She could also be stubborn, and she could be impossible, and all of the things that teenagers could really be. But you do the same with Otto, right? It's because Otto also is ultimately a human being who lost his family and who was trying to do the best that he can after the war. And so you restore his humanity in a way too, that explaining to us that the criticism that we've had of him as somehow being too harsh or taking too much power in documenting or editing the text, that's not really a fair assessment on our part. So. One of the things that really struck me, two things I wanted to say actually, and then ask a question, Ruth, is that your point about Anne hearing on the radio from the Minister of Education that they wanted Dutch people to collect and chronicle what was happening has really led to an unusual number of diaries and journals in Holland compared to other places during the war. And Anne wasn't the only one who was writing this diary. We have an unusual large amount or number of people who wrote, and from tram drivers to journalists to everyday people, housewives who left records. And so many of those are being translated and are available for us. And so it really does give us a great kind of window into what the Dutch experience was like for Jews as well as non-Jews during the war.
Yes, and if people are interested, there's a wonderful book about them in English by the journalist Nina Segal called The Diary Keepers, where she synthesizes stories from a number of these diaries and brings them together to tell the story of the Holocaust in the Netherlands in a really creative and very engaging way.
Absolutely, and I was very happy that she included a couple of the very well-known Dutch diaries that have been translated, some of whom you also mentioned, but Philip Mechanicus was one of them, and he actually talks about these diarists, himself included, as being the ears and the eyes of a piece of Jewish history that that they somehow needed to find a way to explain this to the world, right? And so Anne is in that sense kind of part of a larger body of work that is being written during these years.
Yeah, Philip Mechanicus is such an interesting figure, a diarist from the transit camp Westerbork, who was a journalist who had been deported to that camp and imprisoned there for a long time, more than a year. And he, together with Eddie Hilsum, who some people here may have heard of, she's, I guess, probably the most famous Dutch diarist next to Anne Frank, right? Would you say? And she also wrote a diary in occupied Amsterdam, as well as letters from Westerbork, together with Mechanicus, that are really important documents of that camp.
Absolutely, and there are many like that, and the Institute for War Documentation is fabulous in Amsterdam in that regard, in housing the collections of all of these and translating them. One of the things that I was really struck by, Ruth, when you write at some point you pause in the narrative, and I wanted to quote you here. She said, "Something's holding me back here." It's one of Anne's elves, that is to say, my conscience, right? Didn't I promise to write alongside her rather than over her? When I look up from my desk, she's watching me from the sofa across the room, her legs curled under her. "How could you?" I hear her say. "You know I didn't want to publish all that." And so we are reading kind of your thoughts, just like having a kind of an internal conversation with her as you're writing this book. Did you have these kinds of internal conversations with other people whose biographies you've written, or was this kind of unique to this is it part of the process, in other words, of writing somebody's biography, or was it rather unique to this project?
No, I think it is part of the process of writing a biography, and I'll say that I recognize, the journalist Janet Malcolm has written about the biographer as a burglar who goes through somebody's dresser and rifles through their drawers looking for the family jewels. And I will say that I am keenly aware of the sense of violation that there is in writing a biography, and that's in some ways exactly what you are doing. You're looking at private diaries, in the case of Anne Frank's diary, of course, it's open to the world, but there is this whole version A, this rough draft that she didn't intend for people to see. And yet, here I am mining it for details about her thoughts and about her life. And, with Shirley Jackson, certainly I felt this way as well. She didn't ask me to go through her letters and her papers and, to be trying to figure out, what lay behind some of the, the fiction that she wrote, what motivated her and all that. So yeah, I am definitely motivated by a hefty dose of guilt in this respect. And I'll just say that I think the thing that justifies it is that it's in service to a better understanding of these amazing writers and their work. I feel that what I've done in this book, as with my Shirley Jackson book, is hopefully to bring another generation of readers to Anne, to her diary, maybe with a different kind of appreciation of what that book is and what it's capable of doing, or hopefully to encourage all of the people who have read it to maybe take a fresh look at it. And that's why I dedicated this book to all of Anne's readers, because it didn't feel to me like this book belonged to me. That it wasn't for me to dedicate it to my children or my husband, or the way one normally does. It felt like it was part of a larger world, this universe around Anne Frank and all those who love her so deeply and have been so inspired by her.
Yeah. And we've become part of the conversation then too, as we're reading your book, right? You're kind of in conversation with her as you're writing the story, but as we're reading it, we're asking some of the same questions. And so it becomes kind of this little community of people who are remembering her. Was there anything that really surprised you in your research as you were, you must have gone back to Amsterdam, because the way that you described the city in such detail, I thought, oh, she's walking from Anne's old apartment to the Herengracht, and so I could just kind of see you walk and noticing the willow trees, and so you must have. Was there anything that particularly surprised you as you were doing your research?
I would say, honestly, the thing that surprised me most was how much I had to learn about the Holocaust. I have, like you, I've spent most of my adult life learning about the Holocaust, researching it in some way or other. And yet, when I started really digging deep into the Holocaust in the Netherlands and the way it had unfolded, there was so much that I didn't know. And it made me aware of the depth and breadth of this vast subject. There were stories about the camps, for instance, that I didn't know. I really didn't know very much about the camps, Mauthausen, or especially Sobibor. All of those stories, that information was new to me. Why? Because there were so few survivors of those camps. That very few people were left to tell those stories. Um, but yeah, I would say that's the part that surprised me the most. That as much as I sometimes feel that I already know about the Holocaust, that there's still so much left to learn about it. And
Yeah, so much we
it's
don't know.
Absolutely. And so much that we can never know because nobody is around to give testimony. But I will say another thing that surprised me actually that I wish people spoke about more was the difference between what happened to men and women in the camps. For decades, it was really kind of taboo even to ask this question, did women experience the Holocaust in a different way than men? Um, and, in trying to trace what had happened to Anne in Auschwitz and then later in Bergen-Belsen, since, of course, she didn't leave any testimony from those camps in her own voice, I read a lot of testimony from other people, other women who had been in those camps around the same time as she had, especially Dutch women, to try to extrapolate. In some cases, these were women who actually were with her in the camps, were friends with her and remembered her. But in other cases, they were just people who happened to be there at the same time. And I tried to extrapolate what I could from their testimonies to imagine what she might have experienced. And the thing that was so striking was that, I realized the extent to which the survivor stories that we know the best, the stories of Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi, for instance, are the stories of men. And so we have in our heads an image of a typical concentration camp inmate that is a man. And for women, things were somewhat different. And I'll just say briefly, that one of the major differences was that in Auschwitz, women didn't wear these striped concentration camp uniforms that we picture. They wore ordinary clothes, but ordinary clothes that were, doled out like so many things that the Nazis did with an eye towards whatever would be most torturous. So that there were women in Auschwitz, or I should say most properly in Birkenau, since that was the women's camp at Auschwitz, wearing, silk evening gowns and high-heeled shoes that, didn't protect them against the elements and were, in fact, just another way in which the Nazis sought to torture them. So, that's just one, seemingly small detail about the different way that women were treated that nonetheless had huge repercussions.
Yeah,
And so I think
absolutely.
it's important to remember that, to the Nazis, Anne was a woman. She was treated as a woman, taken into the women's camp, even though we often think of her as a child, and she was persecuted as a Jewish woman.
Yeah, and I agree with that point, is that there's and even as a Dutch citizen who works on this material, there's so much we don't know, right? And so much still to learn about this. And especially when it comes to the Netherlands too, and we talked about this a little bit last week, that the Dutch themselves are still trying to come to terms with much of this, right? If they're on the Jewish history and the tragedies that unfolded in Europe and in Holland. And as you well know, the percentage of the Dutch Jewish population that did not survive the Holocaust is the highest in Holland and all of Central and Western Europe. I mean, and it's still so much of a kind of a question mark to so many Dutch people to try to come to terms with that, and counter to the popular perception of the country as a very liberal place, right? A tolerant place for Jews. And so that is absolutely, I feel the same way. There's so much still that we don't know, so much still to learn. One of the things that was underlined again in your book as well is how different so many of these camps were. Westerbork is a Dutch transit camp, so fundamentally different as Mauthausen would be, or that Auschwitz was, and Auschwitz-Birkenau was. And so the experiences of Jewish women and men in all of these camps was also so entirely different. I didn't know, by the way, how much Mauthausen was a kind of that the language of Mauthausen was so much present in Westerbork, that seemed to be much more of a fear among the Jewish population there than Auschwitz, which was, nobody really knew what that place was, but they knew Mauthausen. So it's
Right, because Dutch men were deported to Mauthausen very early and
yeah.
didn't come back, right? They knew that Mauthausen was a place where people went to die.
Yeah, very much in very different ways than Auschwitz, which that nobody had really heard of
Right.
before.
Nobody
So
knew.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so we'll almost out of time. I think we're
Looks
maybe
like we
we
have a lot of questions.
yes. So I certainly don't want to have too little time for questions. So Alyssa, I think you
Yeah.
were ready to take over and ask some questions from the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like you said, we have a lot of questions here. And there's a few questions that touch on a similar subject. There's been a lot of conversation between the two of you regarding different versions of the diary. You know, some people may have known there were versions, some people may not have known that there are versions. So are all three or however many versions there are available somewhere to the public? And what does the definitive edition, how does that fit in among these versions?
Good. Okay. Yeah. So they are available. Since we're here in my home office, I can just show you.
Ooh, show and
Um,
tell, yes.
This is the scholarly version that I used writing my book. It's known as the critical edition. There's a revised version of it also, but this is the one that's most commonly available. I can just show you that it prints the three versions together on one page. I'm looking for a page that has a good example of this. So you can kind of read them all together. Okay, so you can't, it's probably going to be hard to see, but here at the top is the A version,
Mm.
and then we have the B version, and then we have the C version. So you can look at them all and compare. And there's another edition that is more readily available than this one, and I'll just get that one off the shelf too. It's in this book, Anne Frank, The Collected Works. It's laid out in a somewhat different way. So you get first version A, then version B, then the other version and all that. So yes, there's this another version called the definitive version. This was produced by the Anne Frank Foundation during the 90s. It incorporates some of the material that Anne left out of version A. So it's quite a bit longer than Otto's version. I think it's about a third again as long. And so it has more of the quote unquote missing pages that were discovered then. I personally don't love the term definitive edition just because I don't believe there can be a definitive edition of a book like Anne's Diary that has so many different versions, just as I don't believe that there's such a thing as definitive biography. I think that all subjects are, available to be revisited. But there is a version of Anne's Diary that is, I think, now the most popular and it's probably the most frequently used in schools, that is known as the definitive edition. And it's called that because it incorporates more of Anne's original material than the originally published version.
Wow, thank you so much for that insight and showing us that book. Could you repeat one more time what that book was called that you pulled off your shelf?
Okay, so this is the one published by the Dutch Institute for War Research. It's called The Critical Edition. The Diary of Anne Frank, the critical edition, and it's available in larger libraries or university libraries. And this one is called Anne Frank, the Collected Works, and this one's available from wherever, Amazon
Beautiful.
stores, wherever.
Beautiful. And then obviously folks should purchase your book so that they can have all of the collection together and get the biggest information.
Here it is
Exactly.
on the shelf.
Yeah,
Okay.
beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, so they can have the best information and the best insight on Anne Frank. Fabulous. Okay, another question here is, would you recommend that someone reads Anne's diary first when they're first learning perhaps about the Holocaust, or would you suggest using it more as a guide in their learning?
Interesting question. I mean, I think many students still do read Anne's diary quite early on in their journey to learning about the Holocaust. I think it's often read in middle school or early in high school. And, I think it's hard to answer the question of how should students be, or how should children be taught about the Holocaust is, such a big one, and one that all parents will treat in their own way. But I think Anne Frank's diary has been a first entry point into that for many, many children, for the good reason that it is so accessible and approachable. And the stuff about the death camps, I think, can come later. Saskia,
Beautiful.
do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's we need to contextualize Anne in order to understand what's, to think about Dutch Jewish history, what's actually happening under the Nazi regime. And so in that sense, be very useful to read her alongside other works. And so that's it's a difficult question to answer, I think, depending on the age of the child, and if you do so in school or if you do so as a bedtime reading, right? And so at the university where we teach, we read her and other diaries and other primary source material in contextualizing it with lectures and then with secondary literature. These kids are older, right? These are college kids at age, and so maybe different for younger children. But you're right, it's so accessible. It's a wonderful introduction in many ways, but it can't stand on its own. And so we, to fully understand her, we need more than that.
Beautiful. Thank you both. So I think I have time perhaps for two more questions, but there's a question here that I definitely want to get to, and it's Ruth, what angle of Anne Frank's life or personality of Anne Frank did you research that revealed something that was not known before?
What angle? Interesting. One thing that I looked at very, very closely was her reading. She mentions often in her diary the books that she's reading. Otto was very vigilant about making sure that his daughters, as well as Peter, kept up with their schoolwork in the annex. And so she often mentions the books that she's reading. Lists of them have been published in different places. And she also kept a little book of important quotations, passages that she marked down from her reading that were especially important to her. And I looked closely at those also because, I think the things that we notice in what we read can reveal so much, not necessarily about the literature that we're reading, but they reveal a lot about who we are and what we're looking for. And so one thing that I actually noticed was that Anne mentions reading the letters of a German noblewoman who went to live in France, was married off to a member of the French nobility and went to live in France starting as a teenager, named Lieselotte van der Pfalz. And her letters are a classic in Germany, not much read elsewhere in the world at this point. But she wrote letters. She was a prolific letter writer, writing letters back to her family and friends in Germany, protesting against the situation in which she was kept in the court. She's complained that she was kept basically in captivity by the king's tyranny. She wasn't allowed to go out on her own. She wasn't allowed to travel. And I couldn't help but thinking that this sounded a lot like Anne's situation. And it didn't surprise me when I read these letters and I found some echoes from them in some of the things that Anne had written in her diary. So it's pretty clear to me that Anne, found inspiration in reading the letters of, this obscure German noblewoman who nobody really discusses anymore.
And since we only have a couple minutes left, I do just want to give time to the both of you for any final remarks on today's program, on the book, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day before we close out.
Ruth, you want to go first?
Well, I'm grateful that we're all here to be remembering Anne Frank on this day, 80 years after the liberation of Auschwitz. It's truly sobering to think about where Otto Frank was on this day 80 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And to think about where we are and how far we've come.
Absolutely. There's also an exhibit that's opening up in New York City on Anne Frank, together with the publication of your book. It seems that Anne Frank is in the news this year in ways that is maybe, I don't know if it's the same in Europe or in Holland even so, but it's you do a great job contextualizing when she became famous in the first place, Ruth, in the 50s and 60s, and what kind of the larger landscape that begins to kind of put the limelight on her. Maybe a last question for us to consider. Why do you think Anne Frank is so much in the news these days? And what's this particular context that we are in today to that shines new light on her?
Well, I think that, Otto was explicit in his desire that the diary, as he said, work against persecution and tyranny everywhere as a document of tolerance. And, we have no lack of persecution and tyranny in our world. People have been reaching to Anne Frank as an inspiration, people who are suffering under different political circumstances, everyone from anti-apartheid activists in South Africa to, people acting in the US as allies of migrants in this country who face deportation and so on. And, I think as long as we have persecution and tyranny, Anne Frank is going to remain a beacon for people around the world.
Yeah, we may say that we need her more now than we ever have, right? And so it's maybe to end on that note that that she is still even more relevant today as she has been in the past.
Yes.
Absolutely. Well, Ruth, thank you so much for bringing Anne Frank into a new light for us in this fabulous book. A reminder to our audience to purchase the book and learn with Ruth, just as Ruth, went on this huge journey to learn about Anne Frank and bring that all to you. Thank you to Dr. Saskia Coenen Snyder for being with us today and facilitating this fabulous interview. A reminder to folks that these free webinars are available because of donors like you. So please remember to click the link in the chat and share what you can so that we can keep bringing these fabulous speakers to you every week. Thank you all so much for joining us. Please have a safe and commemorative International Holocaust Remembrance Day and have a great rest of your afternoon. Ruth and Saskia, thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Thank you. Bye.